At 4 in the morning on March 28, 1979, a nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania began losing the one thing it could not survive without: water. Coolant was escaping continuously through a valve that should have closed automatically. Inside the reactor vessel, the water level was falling. The upper portion of the nuclear core was slowly being uncovered. But inside the control room, the instruments appeared to show the opposite problem: too much water. So the operators made a decision that sounds almost impossible in hindsight, but made perfect sense based on the information in front of them. They reduced the emergency water entering the reactor. They did not know the core was beginning to uncover. They did not know temperatures inside the vessel were rising. And they did not know that the actions they were taking to protect the reactor were helping to destroy it. The operators had not ignored their training. They were following it. And that was the problem. This is the story of 3 Mile Island. Not the story of a reactor seconds away from exploding like a nuclear bomb. That was never the real danger. The true story is stranger, more technical, and far more unsettling. Because the reactor never stopped communicating with the people controlling it. It kept producing signals. It kept sounding alarms. It kept filling the room with information. But it failed to tell them the one thing they desperately needed to know. The core was running out of water. By 1979, nuclear power was no longer presented as an experiment. It was infrastructure. Across the United States, commercial reactors were quietly generating electricity for millions of homes. Nuclear energy was promoted as disciplined, reliable, and modern, a technological answer to growing energy demand and the instability of foreign oil. 3 Mile Island stood on a narrow strip of land in the Susquehanna River, only a few miles from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The facility already had one operating reactor. Its second unit had entered commercial operation on December 30th, 1978. When the accident began, Unit 2 had been commercially operating for less than 3 months. This was not an aging machine held together by improvised repairs. It was one of the newest nuclear power units in the United States. Unit 2 was a pressurized water reactor. Its basic principle was simple, even elegant. Water circulated through the nuclear core under enormous pressure. The fuel heated that water to temperatures far beyond its normal boiling point, but because the system was pressurized, the water remained liquid. That superheated water then traveled through steam generators, where it transferred heat to a second, separate loop. The water in that secondary loop turned into steam. The steam drove a turbine. The turbine turned a generator, and the generator produced electricity. The radioactive water surrounding the core remained isolated inside the primary system. The water turning the turbine circulated in a separate secondary system. 2 loops. One carried heat away from the reactor. The other transformed that heat into power. As long as water continued moving through the core, carrying away the heat, the reactor could remain under control. The entire accident that followed would revolve around a question the control room could not answer directly. Was there still enough water surrounding the nuclear fuel? The first failure did not happen inside the reactor core. It began on the non-nuclear side of the plant. At approximately 4 in the morning, pumps feeding water to the steam generators stopped working. Without that feed water, the secondary system could no longer remove heat from the primary loop normally. Heat began accumulating. Pressure inside the reactor system started to rise. The turbine shut down automatically. Seconds later, the reactor also responded, exactly as designed. Control rods dropped into the core, absorbing neutrons and interrupting the nuclear chain reaction. The reactor had scrammed. From the perspective of its automatic safety systems, the plant had successfully protected itself. The chain reaction was stopped. But shutting down a nuclear reactor does not make the heat disappear. Even after fission ends, the radioactive materials inside the fuel continue to decay. That decay produces enormous residual heat. Immediately after shutdown, the core remains intensely hot. It must continue receiving cooling water for hours, days, and even longer as the decay heat gradually falls. The chain reaction had ended. The need for cooling had not. As pressure rose during the initial failure, a safety valve opened near the top of the pressurizer. The pressurizer was a large vessel connected to the primary cooling system. Its purpose was to help control pressure throughout the reactor loop. When pressure became too high, the pilot-operated relief valve, commonly called the PORV, opened automatically. Steam and water escaped through the valve, lowering the pressure. That was exactly what it had been designed to do. Once pressure returned to an acceptable level, the valve was supposed to close. It did not. The valve remained physically stuck open. The primary cooling system now had an open path through which reactor coolant could escape. Water protecting the nuclear fuel began flowing out of the sealed system. The operators did not realize this was happening. On the control panel, a light indicated that electrical power had been removed from the mechanism that held the relief valve open. To the operators, this suggested the valve had closed, but the indicator was not connected to a sensor confirming the valve's physical position. It showed the electrical condition of the control circuit. It did not show whether the metal valve itself had actually moved. The command had changed. The machine had not obeyed. The panel had answered one question. Had power been removed from the valve's opening mechanism? But the question that actually mattered was different. Was the valve physically closed? The control room had no direct answer. As far as the operators could see, the pressure relief event was over. The reactor had shut down. The valve appeared to be closed. The automatic emergency systems had activated. What they could not see was that the primary cooling system was continuing to drain. The control room at 3 Mile Island was not calm. Within minutes, alarms were sounding throughout the room. Warning lights illuminated across enormous banks of panels. New signals appeared faster than the operators could interpret them. A computer printer recorded the sequence of events, but the flood of information overwhelmed its ability to produce a useful real-time picture. The men in the room were surrounded by data, but data is not the same thing as understanding. Some instruments showed pressure, others showed temperature, others showed the condition of pumps, valves, tanks, electrical circuits, and safety systems. There were hundreds of indicators, but there was no direct instrument showing the water level around the reactor core itself. The operators had to infer that level from other measurements. One of the most important was the water level inside the pressurizer. Under normal operating conditions, the pressurizer level helped indicate the condition of the primary cooling system, and during the accident, that level appeared to be rising. To the operators, this suggested that the system was becoming too full. That was dangerous for a different reason. If the pressurizer filled completely with water, a condition operators called going solid, pressure could become difficult to control. The operators had been trained to avoid that condition. The pressurizer looked increasingly full. Emergency water was entering the system, so the diagnosis seemed logical. There was already too much water. But the pressurizer gauge was telling the truth about the wrong part of the system. As coolant escaped through the stuck valve, pressure fell. Water elsewhere in the primary system began boiling. Steam bubbles and empty spaces, known as voids, formed throughout the piping and reactor vessel. That expanding steam displaced water and pushed it toward the pressurizer. The pressurizer level rose even while the total amount of coolant in the reactor system was falling. The gauge was not necessarily broken. The operators were reading it correctly, but they were assigning it a meaning it could no longer provide. The pressurizer appeared full. The core beneath it was losing water. The control room saw the symptom. It could not see the system. Believing they were preventing the pressurizer from filling completely, the operators reduced the high-pressure emergency injection. That emergency system had automatically begun forcing additional water into the reactor. It was doing exactly what the core needed. But because the instruments suggested excess water, the operators throttled it back. They did not completely remove emergency cooling, but they significantly restricted it at the moment the reactor was losing coolant through the open valve. The operators were not behaving irrationally. They were responding to the danger their training and instruments had taught them to recognize. The real danger was the opposite. As coolant continued escaping, steam entered the reactor coolant pumps. These enormous pumps were designed to move solid water through the core. They were not designed to pump a mixture of water, steam, and gas. The pumps began vibrating violently. Operating them under those conditions risked severe mechanical damage. To protect the equipment, the operators shut down the pumps. Again, the decision was defensible. Again, it made the real emergency worse. Without the pumps, the forced circulation of water through the reactor core stopped. The system was now losing coolant through the open relief valve. Emergency injection had been reduced. The main circulation pumps were no longer running, and the operators still believed the reactor contained more water than it actually did. Every action was based on a picture that made sense, and the picture was wrong. As the water level continued to fall, the top of the reactor core became exposed. Nuclear fuel that should have remained submerged was now surrounded, partly by steam. The fuel continued producing decay heat. Without enough liquid water carrying that heat away, temperatures rose rapidly. A nuclear meltdown is not the same thing as a nuclear explosion. A commercial power reactor cannot detonate like an atomic bomb. The fuel, geometry, enrichment, and physical conditions are entirely different. A meltdown means the cooling systems can no longer maintain the fuel in its intended form and position. The metal structures surrounding the fuel begin overheating. Fuel assemblies deform. Protective materials fail, and parts of the core can begin melting and collapsing inside the reactor vessel. At 3 Mile Island, the metal cladding surrounding the fuel rods was made primarily of a zirconium alloy. At extreme temperatures, zirconium reacts with steam. That chemical reaction produces additional heat. It also creates hydrogen gas. As the uncovered fuel overheated, the cladding began to fail. Fuel assemblies cracked and deformed. Parts of the reactor core began melting and shifting downward inside the vessel. This was no longer a near miss. A partial meltdown was already underway. It became the most serious accident in the history of American commercial nuclear power. Yet 2 of the plant's largest protective barriers continued doing what they were designed to do. The thick steel reactor vessel held the damaged core. Around it, the massive reinforced concrete containment building limited the release of radioactive material into the environment. The systems closest to the fuel had failed catastrophically. The final physical barriers had not. For more than 2 hours, the stuck relief valve continued draining coolant while operators searched for an explanation that fit the information in front of them. At approximately 6:22 in the morning, operators closed a separate block valve installed in series with the stuck relief valve. That second valve finally isolated the leaking path. The continuous loss of coolant stopped. But closing the valve did not reverse what had already happened. The core had been damaged. Hydrogen had been produced. The internal condition of the reactor remained poorly understood. Stopping the leak took a little more than 2 hours. Establishing reliable cooling and understanding the true condition of the core took much longer. The uncertainty continued for days. One of the most frightening uncertainties involved hydrogen. The reaction between overheated zirconium and steam had produced a large amount of hydrogen gas inside the reactor vessel and primary cooling system. Engineers feared that the hydrogen could combine with oxygen and form a flammable or explosive mixture. The public heard the phrase hydrogen bubble. Television reports repeated it, newspapers placed it on front pages. To people outside the nuclear industry, it sounded like a bomb was forming inside the reactor. For a time, even experts were uncertain about the exact danger. The internal condition of the damaged reactor was difficult to measure. Radiation levels complicated access. Instrumentation had not been designed to describe a partially melted core. Engineers were trying to understand a machine operating far outside the conditions they had expected it to experience. Later analyses showed that there was not enough oxygen inside the reactor system to produce the feared explosion. But that conclusion was not obvious during the crisis. For several days, America watched engineers manage a damaged reactor they could not directly see inside. Outside the plant, another crisis was growing. Public trust was collapsing. Official statements were sometimes confusing or contradictory. Plant representatives, regulators, state officials, and federal authorities did not always communicate the same level of risk. Governor Dick Thornburgh advised pregnant women and preschool-aged children within 5 miles of the plant to leave the area temporarily. There was no general mandatory evacuation order, but many residents left voluntarily. Roads filled with families who did not know whether they were escaping a genuine catastrophe or reacting to incomplete information. National reporters arrived in Pennsylvania. Cameras gathered outside the plant. For several days, 3 Mile Island became the most important news story in the United States. By an almost unbelievable coincidence, a film called The China Syndrome had opened in American theaters less than 2 weeks before the accident. The movie depicted a nuclear power plant concealing a potentially catastrophic safety failure. Suddenly, fiction and reality seemed to overlap. The accident confirmed the public's deepest fears at precisely the moment popular culture had given those fears a visual language. In the end, the reactor was brought under control. There was no nuclear explosion. The containment building did not fail. There was no mass casualty event. Subsequent investigations and health studies found that radiation releases to the surrounding population were small, with no clear measurable public health impact attributed to the accident. But those facts did not erase what had happened. A nearly new nuclear reactor had partially melted down. Its operators had made the situation worse while following the information and training available to them. And for hours, the most important fact inside the plant had remained invisible to the people responsible for controlling it. 3 Mile Island did not single-handedly stop the expansion of nuclear power in the United States. That slowdown had already begun. Construction costs were rising, electricity demand was changing, projects were being delayed or canceled, regulation was becoming more demanding. But 3 Mile Island became the accident every future nuclear project would have to answer for. It became the image the industry would spend a generation trying to escape. More importantly, the accident forced nuclear engineering to reconsider what safety actually meant. Before 3 Mile Island, designers often assumed that providing operators with more information would make a plant safer. More gauges, more lights, more alarms, more procedures. But the control room at 3 Mile Island had no shortage of information. Its failure was not silence. Its failure was interpretation. After the accident, operator training changed. Full-scale simulators became central to preparing crews for complex emergencies. Emergency procedures were redesigned to focus more on the symptoms of reactor conditions, rather than relying only on operators to identify the precise malfunction. Control room layouts were reconsidered. Alarm systems were studied. Human factors engineering became impossible to treat as an afterthought. The central question changed. It was no longer simply, how much information can a control room display? It became, can a human being, under extreme pressure, understand what the machine is actually trying to say? 3 Mile Island was not caused by one stupid mistake. It was caused by a chain of mechanical failures, misleading indications, incomplete instrumentation, flawed assumptions, and rational human decisions made inside the wrong mental model. The control room was full of information, but it was empty of clarity. Hundreds of indicators surrounded the operators. Not one directly told them the fact that mattered most. The core is running out of water. The reactor never lost its ability to speak. It kept producing signals. It kept sounding alarms. It kept talking the entire time. It simply told the truth about the wrong parts of itself. If stories about machines that failed in ways no one expected are your kind of thing, subscribe. Because the most dangerous failure is not always a machine going silent. Sometimes it keeps talking and tells you the wrong story. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed uncovering this story, hit like and subscribe to The Unlikely Colossus. There are plenty more untold stories of engineering and ambition still to come.